The Gaillard Center has taken the wheel on important discussions here in the Lowcountry. They're raising the volume series hosted by poet laureate Marcus Amaker and Grammy award-winning musician Charlton Singleton aims at shedding light and understanding on the Black diaspora here in the South. Local journalist and author Herb Frazier will be featured in episode 4 of the series, and we're glad to have him with us today on the nation's observance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Thank you, sir, for joining us, and it's really such an honor to be able to talk to you.
Listen, thank you for this opportunity, and it's an honor to be with you as well.
So before we get into episode 4, I'd like our audience to understand your history as a journalist here in the Lowcountry. You worked for 5 different newspapers here in the state, one of which is the Post and Courier, but you were also named South Carolina Press Association Journalist of the Year in 1990. So tell us a little bit about your time as a journalist.
Well, I started my journalism career in April 1972 when I got an internship at the then News and Courier, and I left the News and Courier in late 72 and got a full-time reporting job, or a regular reporting job, I should say, at the state newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina. And I worked there for a couple years, and then I went to New Orleans and worked with the Times-Picayune. I got homesick for South Carolina, and I called the state and asked them if they would take me back. They took me back, and I stayed there nearly 10 years. And in 1985, I wanted to see more of this country. I wanted to challenge myself as a journalist at a larger newspaper, so I applied for a job at the Dallas Times-Herald, and then I worked there for almost 3 years. And unfortunately, I got homesick again.
Something kept pulling you back in.
Keeps bringing me back. And then I applied for a job at the Charlotte Observer. And then I came back to Charleston in the spring of 1988. Wow. And ended my career at the Post and Courier in 2006.
Well, you've had an incredible career in this industry that has taken you not just around the country, but all over the world. Can you tell us about some of the major stories that you covered?
Well, I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I covered some of the tensions between South Korea and North Korea when I visited Korea. I have reported from Japan on that trip to Asia. I covered the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, I believe it was. And then I taught journalism at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa, for a year. All the while I was at the Post and Courier. The paper at that time gave me an opportunity to pursue stories around the country as well as around the world. And I tried to find Charleston-related angles to international and national stories. But the one thing that I enjoyed the most is the opportunity to report on Gullah culture from the Caribbean and West Africa.
Now, when you're talking about covering the news far away from the Lowcountry, and it kept bringing you back, was there ever a story that really stood out for you that you covered here at home, as opposed to some of those major stories that the entire world was aware of?
Well, you as a journalist, you know that the power of the press, the power of what you do and what I did as a newspaper reporter, we have a great deal of influence on a variety of people. Yeah. And that's a question that you just asked, is a question that I've been asked a lot when I speak to journalism students, high school and on the college level. And when I worked for the state newspaper, one of the most important stories I think I ever did was the story of a couple, an elderly couple in rural South Carolina, in rural Fairfield County, who did not have the money to connect to a water line that was coming through Jenkinsville. Jenkinsville is up in Fairfield County, and that's where the V.C. Summer nuclear power plant is. I did a story on this couple, and when that story ran, the community outpouring was just tremendous. It provided the money to not only help this couple connect to the water line and have running water and indoor plumbing in their house for the first time, but also people came by and fixed up their house, stopped the leaks, repaired the holes, repaired the floors. And so that is the power of this medium. That's the power that you and I have to do good in this world and in this country.
And that's the kind of story that you would want to be remembered by, and also that you would remember the most when looking back at a lifetime of reporting on everything, which I think when you make a difference in one person's life, that's enough.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is a great place to take a break. So when we come back, I want to start getting into raising the volume over the Gaillard Center and what your discussion was about, some of the interesting topics that affect folks right here in the Lowcountry. So we're going to do that in 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome back. We've been chatting with journalist and author Herb Frazier, who had decades of experience as a journalist around the country, reporting on some of the most important stories around the world. Now, when you hung up your journalism cap, you also worked at Magnolia Plantations and Garden. So tell me a bit about that transition of leaving the reporter life and entering into a new sphere.
Well, when I joined Magnolia November 1st, 2010, that gave me an opportunity to use my skills as a journalist to help tell the stories that are important to Magnolia. As you know, Magnolia is America's oldest garden. It was established in the late 1700s by the Drayton family. And the gardens is known internationally. But one of the things that I think Magnolia does well is to tell the stories of the enslaved people who planted those azaleas and camellias, who tended to those gardens over generations, and who were there when the gardens opened up to the public in 1870 as Charleston's first tourist attraction. I think a lot of visitors who come there and don't know that history need to understand that history, that the Lowcountry community, the Lowcountry culture is so heavily influenced by people of African descent.
And remembering our history is so invaluable. Yes. Being able to be there, to touch it, to smell it, to see it. I have to ask you, and I was a little hesitant to ask you this question because I don't want to get political by any means, but there was a lot of uproar about whether or not they should change their name. How do you feel about it still being called Magnolia Plantation and Gardens?
That's a very good question, and it's one that that is on discussion now. I think Magnolia needs to keep the name Plantation because if you change the name, that might suggest you have something to hide. Don't be afraid of your past, I think, or any former plantation site in this country, but use that opportunity to inform people of that history so we don't fall into the traps to repeat that history. And there are some people around the country who come looking for that history. And I think that sets places like that apart. Now, one other thing that's important, and what Magnolia has done in the last 2 years, I think it was, is to use its site as a place for conversations around racial reconciliation and racial healing. So I know there are a lot of people who shun places, named plantations, but me as a Charlestonian, and knowing that my ancestors came from West Africa because I did a DNA test, it is important for me to tell those stories of our ancestors, of my ancestors. And what better place is to do those stories is at a place like Magnolia. Not that it's not the only place that you can tell stories, but at least it's one of the many places here in Charleston that we can celebrate and remember that pain, heal from that pain, and celebrate those people who contributed to this culture.
Absolutely. What you just said, it just raised the hairs on my arms. I think that is such a poignant point that you make. And right now, I think what we're going to do is we're going to take another break. When we come back, speaking of open discussions, we're going to talk about episode 4 of the Gaillard Center's Raising the Volume series. So we're going to do that. We'll be right back. The Gaillard Center's Raising the Volume series has been a wonderful opportunity for prominent people in our Lowcountry community to come together and have important discussions, thoughtful discussions, and they are honored with Herb Frazier's presence as we are today here on Fox 24 News Now. You are being featured in episode 4, and can you tell us a little sneak peek about what was discussed in that particular episode?
Well, with Charleston, my friend Charleston, who I was introduced to through our mutual friend, the late Jack McCrae, we talked about my growing up in Charleston. The first 14 years of my life was spent in the Ansonboro community and the projects that used to be at the east end of Calhoun Street that are no longer there. And of course, I was a student at Buse Elementary School, which is on Calhoun Street, and I attended Emmanuel AME Church across the street from the school. So we had a really good talk about those early years and growing up in a segregated community. It was different in Charleston at that time. As a kid growing up there, I had very, very little interaction with white people because the east side of Charleston was predominantly Black. But my father was in the Navy, so we would go up to the naval base. My grandmother raised me, and we would shop in the commissary, and I would go to the doctors. So it was an interesting juxtaposition of a highly segregated civilian community, but then we went and we moved freely around an integrated military community at the naval base. So it was an interesting childhood, up until the time I was about 14 years old.
That is fascinating. Well, I think it's going to be a treat for people to learn more about you and your history and just the history of Charleston that you lived through yourself. So we're going to direct our audience to episode 4 of Raising the Volume series. And I want to end on this note. I know that you're working on something now. Can you give our audience just a quick run of the title? What is it called?
The book that I hope to have out in the next year or so is called Crossing the Sea on a Sacred Song. It's the story of a woman in Georgia, Mary Moran, who is connected with a woman in Sierra Leone, Bendu Jabati, through an ancient funeral song in the Mende language of Sierra Leone.
Wow, that sounds beautiful. That sounds like a fascinating book. Well, we'll be waiting with bated breath for that one to be released, but I'd love to check in with you before then. Herb Frazier, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We're back after this.